Hi, and welcome to this really great episode with Chelsea Freeborn from Freeborn Productions. You got to stay until the end of the episode because we have this amazing conversation about how you can use emotional and psychological measurements to be able to create ROI for your event. And we really get into how to measure ROI and start talking about some interesting theories on what measurements you can use to get in with your stakeholders. So I hope you enjoy the episode. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Welcome to another episode of Production Value Matters, the business events podcast. Today, I'm really thrilled to welcome Chelsea Freeborn, founder of Freeborn Productions and event consultant at MetabaseQ. With over 15 years in the event marketing industry, Chelsea has transitioned from fashion to tech, leading projects in Web3 and cybersecurity. She's known for creating events that not only promote brands, but deeply engage audiences through innovative strategies and a commitment to social consciousness. Chelsea, it's great to have you with us today. How are you?
I'm so good. Thank you for having me, Matthew. I'm so honored to be here. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. So, Chelsea, from earlier in your life, you went from making business cards as a young girl to founding your own company. What are the early influences that sparked your drive for leadership and entrepreneurship?
I really have to give credit to my father. He's an amazing businessman, and so is my mom. I come from a family of entrepreneurs, and I don't know if you had this, but I'm from California, and in school we had these like assignments where we had to go and sell little things to like raise money for certain, accomplishments in our classes. And that's kind of what inspired me. I realized really quickly it's easier to convince some people to help you with that process than it is to just do it like singularly. So I would build out these tiny little teams, like recruiting my parents and my sister and then like their friends to go and help me to build sales. And so that's kind of where it all led into and started. And then I remember the first time I saw my dad's business card and, founder of Freeborn Finances. And I was like, oh my gosh, I want to do that. And I was just like a proud little girl that like loved her dad and what he did. So
I'm going to have to ask your dad for some tips because I'm trying to get my kids to see me in the same way, but we'll come back to that. So throughout your like diverse career journey, like what pivotal moments led you from sort of the fashion industry to establishing Freeborn Productions?
Great question. So establishing Freeborn Productions was, continuous journey. I've been an entrepreneur, like I said before, pretty much since I was 11 years old. And there's been a lot of iterations of Freeborn Living, Freeborn Lifestyles, Goddess Rebellion Retreats, and a lot of subsidiary companies that I've developed. But I really have to give credit as well to my mentor, this woman named Allison Storr. She was revolutionary in me switching my career. Originally, I was in fashion and PR communications. I started really young. And Allison took me under her wing. I was just randomly in New York City. It wasn't random. I was actually living in New York City at the time. I was catering an event. I was in this little transition, kind of trying to figure out what I was going to do with myself. I was just about, 19 years old. And I met Allison and she saw my potential and she was like, what do you do every day? Like, what are you into? And I was like interning and she's like, why don't you come and help me? And she helped me build my career. She gave me my first clients for Freeborn Productions, and she really guided me into the marketing and as well as events business today.
That's really amazing. And so I'm so glad you were able to connect. And it's funny when that kind of thing happens that it's almost like a kismet or like a destined moment, right? And one that I think every event professional should remain open to at all times, right? Of that particular moment of, oh, this is somebody who could teach me, who could mentor me or open a door. Sometimes I think we put a little bit too much pressure on ourselves as professionals to like just know it coming out of the bay. And I think that, part of the maturing of the industry is that we're finding those opportunities. Okay. So let's talk about you're going into the events world and psychology and event design. Could you explain why psychological principles, in your opinion, should influence the approach to an event design, and what key theories or concepts do you consider when you're planning an event?
Absolutely. And thanks so much for realizing those insights, because I think they're the most imperative of any event. My background not only is in events and marketing, but also psychology and like human development. I'm interestingly enough taking a lifespan development course to enhance my event psychology, because people are really impacted by the experiences at hand, right? We have traumatic experiences as well as like glimmers or influential experiences, right? Like for me in events, my first experience was a really glimmered basic moment, right? And it just happened from this key event that I had been a participant in, and the infrastructure of that event was very intentional. So when I was there, it changed kind of the whole dynamic of how I was presenting myself. So that led me on this big journey of really understanding, and so many people before me as well have been key aspects in understanding the psychology in marketing as well as events today. And I think the most important piece of that is really how you're developing your network flow and like a B2B side, right? And how that's going to continue to the attribution and the sales model or lead gen for you longer term. And it's really impactful. Like no matter what, we're still based off of our commonality of our brains. And so if you enhance like the senses in an experience at your trade booth, say it's sight, smell, even hearing, right? You can engage, quote unquote, a business or a consumer into a different way that develops a longer term relationship that also requires, you to have more of a personal touch, which I think in the sales cycle in general, we can lose point on. And I think for me, that's been the biggest piece of it, is to just really create this personalization into experience that leaves everybody feeling a little bit better than when they came in. So that's why.
Yeah. So that's really fascinating. So when you're designing an event, how do you apply those psychological insights to maximize that audience engagement?
I think design is really imperative, right? Like you can only do with so much, say you're in a trade booth, but in an overarching conference or just even a dinner, like design is going to play a key aspect, even in the terms of like the intentional of seating, right? So, or like placement of connection. And I think the ability to have intentional before you're even going into an experience with the pre-production, it's like weddings, right? Weddings are kind of, if you're an event planner, it's one of the most stressful industries. And like for wedding planners in general, and I have a reasoning for this, is that like when they're creating a seating chart, that's where a lot of the stress comes in, right? Because like you're trying to understand who's going to be able to sit next to who and why, if you have the intentionality behind it. And I think that same theory comes into play in your design as well as an intentional of an experience overall. So when you're going and you're wanting to merge your sales team and your marketing team together for, per se, a lead gen, like your intentional of targeting these specific businesses is going to be really important. And so for me, overarching design makes a very big impact, because again, into the senses, like your visual is always going to attract a consumer, like your wording, your branding, and that's your first touch point, right? So on the variance of touch points, how you engage people is through those commonality senses and the intentionality behind that. Immersive design creates this experience that provokes discussion as well as thought, and it leaves an imprint, So for me, those are kind of the key aspects that I think are really imperative in the overall concept.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned sort of wedding planners and putting it into that context of the marketing and the sales, or the customer and the business development team, or the user and the development team, whatever it might be, sort of shifting that mentality to the same way that the grooms and the brides, different factions coming together, and that intentionality in that event design, and in that, whether it's a seating chart, or whether it's, managing breakouts, or who's going to sit where during the awards show, or whatever that context is, it's sort of the same mentality. And I admire wedding planners. That's a business that we don't touch to save our lives, because of like all of the, there's a very, very, very specific set of skills for that, which I just don't have. I can't do it. But I do love that idea of sort of thinking of the purpose and intentionality around your audience the same way that a wedding planner would for the bride and groom's, clans coming together for this joining of families, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Events are, for me, in some aspect, like a marrying of a business or a consumer to, if you're brand facing, right? They're essentially, you're wanting them to have a long-term relationship with you, right? And what's one of the longest relationships that we have contractually is marriage, So it's like, if you look at that, like, how are you going to engage that for people longer term with your brand or your company? And essentially, you're going into quote unquote a marriage together. I'm sure our commitment phobes are going to be like, oh my God, I don't want to marry, but it's true. You know what I mean? It's really true. And it's really important. And like an executive breakout and thought leadership, like placing the right people in that room so that connectivity, even if it's a competitor, can be beneficial to you in the long term. At least that's like what I've seen happen. I'm sure people would have a different opinion on that, but just in like thorough thought leadership and thorough decision making, I think it's very imperative the intentionality of who you're putting there, why you're putting it there, and the overarching design and experience overall.
So could you give me or share a specific example of where that those insights significantly impacted that attendee interaction?
100%. Yeah. So one of my favorite use cases of this for my own self was I consulted for a company called TubeBuddy. It's kind of like a growth model for YouTube, and it helps kind of just build out visibility into your channels. And they were doing a subsidiary VidCon conference, and they needed to have a booth that was engaging and interactive and stood out, but they didn't have per se like the large scale budgets that like, Mr. Beast was there and he has, ability to create this crazy LED wall and these experiences. And, we're trying to figure out how to be engaging while also onboarding people into what they're doing and create an environment where people felt comfortable. And I was like, I pitched this idea to them, and they were a little indifferent because it wasn't something that they were very much used to. And it was like beanbags and a mini coffee shop with free coffee. And we did it. We created this like coffee bar. We created this beanbag lounge and kind of this like working network in a 10 by 10 space. And we had a line all the way through, and people just stayed and sat there the whole entire experience. And like we brought the whole sales team. So every person on sales was like there being able to like talk to people. We ended up extending out and getting like 5 extra iPads because we were onboarding so much that it was this touch point that we touch their senses in the sense of smell, taste, visually, like people see a coffee shop and they want to hang out on beanbag chairs that were branded. It just created this environment that it was a lounge. It was relaxing as well. It went into like your other subsidiary senses too. And that was really amazing. And we just saw it work extremely well. And I was a really happy activation to see. You had like Mr. Beast in his station and his team, which was doing great because of who they are and what they represent. But then also us that was there. And like, we had a line, and no matter that line, like we had at least a 70% touch point with individuals that had shown up just because we created that one experience. And yes, there was like free coffee at per se the whole conference, but for some reason that smell of like fresh roasted espresso and seeing them do it, it just brought back this, visceral experience people wanted to continue over and over again.
I can guarantee you that having attended a lot of industry conferences, for instance, any booth that has better coffee than the free stuff in the hallway, I'm there because I'm a bit of a coffee snob. So I can totally appreciate that smell of fresh roasted coffee and wanting to go there. So what are the most critical design elements that can manipulate and affect attendee psychology? Is it lighting, spacing? Is it about using multimedia in a particular way?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different varieties. I think, listen, with conferences in general, I'll just go to like B2B, like trade shows, kind of because that's where a lot of people end up finding where they're needing to develop out. You're not going to have a lot of ability with lighting, right? And some of the design. But multimedia and then overarching other forms that you can utilize is sight and smell. So creating an experience that's really engaging and almost like a homecoming. There was another food conference that we did, and, we were trying to figure out how we could target individuals to try this new brand. And so we ended up buying food scent that was the smell of cookies. And then we changed it to also like pumpkin spice, where people would walk by and they'd be like, but we didn't have cookies, we didn't have anything that we could give them, but we just realized like this would be, people would probably stop and smell for a second, which was a great opportunity for us to engage them in conversation. And that minor activation, maybe we didn't have the actual physical experience that they were engaging with, but it created an opportunity for conversation to happen, because they'd be like, do you smell that? Or is there cookies somewhere? Or like, and you would just have this next model where people could engage. So sometimes you have to work with the environment that you have. And I think, multimedia is one of my favorite experiences as well. Like, especially if you're on a speaking stage or what kind of other additional engagement you're doing. Like, I think video overall is one of the best ways to engage a community, and, nothing longer than 30 seconds per se, I think is very beneficial, because once you kind of surpass people's attention spans these days. But I think that's also very, very engaging, because we are naturally inclined psychologically now. We've been trained, when we see a screen, we will engage with that screen. It's actually so subconscious. We'll instantly engage it. So you have less than a microsecond to tap into our psychological components of our brain to engage them. And that content that can be on the screen can be one of two ways. If you're going back into like the lizard capacity of the brain, like somewhat of like a shock of like a red or like a harsher tone or something that's kind of like a little, disgust is actually one of the largest activators in psychology, not joy, which is really interesting. So if you can hit into this, which I'm not telling people to go into like creating slime machines or anything like that, but I'm saying like the kind of adherence to this disgust model, right? Or like certain colors can trigger a secondary look, which also gives you this next layer of engagement to your consumer you're trying to attract.
Well, I think that's the entire business model against social media, right now, right? Okay. How do you use design then to strengthen the connection between attendees and the brand message being promoted? Is there do you tailor those elements to align it with a different brand identity? Give me a little insight on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really great question. And it goes kind of back into the framework of what you're trying to execute. I think one thing that's kind of been missed in just, it wasn't really until 2020 we realized how important, I call it peer-to-peer or community marketing is, which is events in general, or B2B. I actually still think it's B2C, because you're still engaging with a person who's a consumer on behalf of a business. But a lot of times, people would just throw into the mix. They'd have these kind of larger spends for these, but they never really understood what the intentionality was behind it. And now after 2020, when we saw events stop or we went virtual and we really had to synthesize this data and or understand why we were doing things, because marketing budgets had shrunk, you now have a lot more opportunity in the pre-production of something to identify what is your intentional and purpose, brand visibility, lead gen. And then also, one of the things I like to do with my clients is be very direct in who we are targeting, and not create our messaging directly to that experience, but in some way attribute it, right? So that it can go across the whole line. What does that look like in sense of, I'm working with this client right now, which is an amazing company called MetabaseQ, which is a cybersecurity company based out of Latin America. And we've created this branding that on our merch, right, that engages people to ask a question that kind of leads everybody in cybersecurity to understand what we're talking about. Because we've noticed within that whole entire space, a lot of people are, they like sci-fi, they like the Matrix. We've just seen that because those conversations are so broad. They're not necessarily measurable, but they're continual. And so we created these hats that are basically sci-fi based hats that are take us to your base, MetabaseQ. And people engage with them and I think it's very catchy. And then we also make quotation cards that engage our CISOs or our executives, our CTOs, that give you cybersecurity little quote unquote hacks, right? That for ransomware 101 or cyber cleanliness, and how do you keep your company in that way? And those engaging conversations impact our consumer, right? So we have the intentional of onboarding a specific segment in that space of CISOs, be it banking, be it tech or, other components of a company. But then also at the same side, we generate the content that we're creating to distribute to be applicable past that as well. So we take the key information. And the thing with even psychology in general within events is that people aren't that different. So like what you're targeting with one brand, maybe, you know, a finance brand or a fintech brand or company, excuse me, you might find also in a cybersecurity company because you target something that actually is their varied interest, right? And so like, and a lot of people do get distracted. Like we are the distracted series of generations now from Gen X down. So you can easily, quote unquote, distract people into building into your brand as well, if that makes sense. I hope.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you say about like that post-pandemic, and I sometimes call it the coolifying of B2B marketing, right? And prior to the pandemic, there was a lot across the industry. And I think that like from the marketing side, the event marketing hybrid place, and then the event side, there was always we always did it this way, and the system's not broken. And then the system got broken to an extreme extent. And as people started to re-justify their marketing budgets and re-justify what those were actually achieving as the goals and the objectives of those properties and those channels, they started to realize that, oh no, B2B marketing can be cool. I remember like 10 years ago trying to talk to my bosses about like, we have a cool product. We have a cool thing. And as you said, it's a slightly B2C. There is a consumer who is buying on behalf of the business, and that consumer is being marketed to in the B2C world or the consumer market world with, surprise and delight and a story and emotional touch points and all of the psychological measures you're talking about to buy a chocolate bar. Right. And that chocolate bar has 0 calorie, like tons of empty calories, and is actually bad for them. All of those things. Now, if we were to apply these same principles to getting things, especially in a B2B market, that are actually solving a business's problems, we'd be gangbusters. And it's interesting that it's now past the pandemic. That has, as I said, like B2B marketing has become cool. There are whole businesses out there and empires being built by agencies and brands who have realized it's cool to be marketing in this world because it's gone beyond sell sheets and specifications and benefits, right? And so it's interesting that you sort of put it in that context of post pandemic. Like this is something that we are trying to do more of. And so leads into my next question, which is, so how do you plan and measure the emotional resonance with your events and attendees in this sort of new scope?
I think measuring events is always this interesting space that's a little bit of a gray area, and nobody's ever figured out the most perfect matrix. If they said they had, like, good on them. But I do think the measuring of an emotional connectivity is really going back to the psychological component of the sense of belonging, right? And that engagement that you have and that conversation that you have. And then also being able to track in the background, like a CRM, and like taking in your, like your sales gen or your lead gen and where that leads to post that. The emotional connectivity in general, for me, from what I've seen on the measurable side, leads into conversation, which then leads into your attribution, depending on where you are if most attribution within events in general within this component, I find, are multi-touch. One of two ways is because first touch, right? You're generating, you're communicating, and then that can happen either at the event or before the event. And why I say it's continuously multi-touch is because you have new individuals that you're engaging with. And then on the secondary side, you have additional people you're engaging with. And on that emotional capacity side, the continued engagement varies all throughout the whole entire line. So it doesn't matter where the touch started from. It's at that exact point where it continues to grow with. And I think, in at least events marketing in general, we hold the largest conversion in the attribution sales cycle, in attribution, just because sales cycles in general can be very long. But once you transition them into events, into peer-to-peer, like conversations, be it, I also consider like an event like a sales dinner where you're engaging one-to-one. The conversion is so much higher. And it's measurable, at the end of the day by return on investment. and or the cost for acquisition, right? Emotional is very much more, it's quote unquote not measurable, but from what I've seen, it is, because you end up being able to plug them into a CRM, which people shouldn't just be able to be plugged into a CRM, but that's what most of us are doing in the event marketing space or in overarching production in general of creating an experience. Now, if we're going from like a producer's mind, right, and we're curating a massive conference and we're onboarding into like, a specific trade show segment, sponsorship, right? Registration. But then overall is like post surveying and seeing how, for me, what's measurable, the experience and how impactful that was, because that for me leads to second year conversion. And, or if it's not a second year conversion to that conference or event itself, it's engagement across socials. And that's traceable, right? Because we have a digital imprint today that is so valuable. And I'm still waiting for a company to develop like an API where you can track people across all social channels and all of their digital imprint to see how much they engage within your sales channels, or within your marketing channels. Maybe it exists. If it does, please email it to me because I would love to work with that.
I'm absolutely sure HubSpot or Salesforce has some kind of back end that they're waiting to sell to everybody. But you are absolutely right that, it's that long-term return, right? I want to pick on something that you just said, which was that a second year sales cycle, right? That it's not, I think a lot of event marketers, B2B sales and marketing people start to evaluate events in particular as a too short of a metric, right? They say, hey, look, we spent, and I'm going to be ridiculous with some numbers here. We spent like $1 million to exhibit at CES, right? And show people our cool product. And then they look at a report 30 to 60 days later and say, like a revenue report or a lead generation report. And they go, I don't know if this actually means anything, or we actually got that ROI, because it didn't exactly equal in a short period of time $2 million in sales, right? And so, but it's interesting that you're putting it in the context of that second year cycle, right? So tracking who engaged with us in that first year, who in theory is a fan and has been watching us, and then in that second year, did they come back? Because that's a key indicator that they're really engaged with us. And then, yes, I would, as an entrepreneur myself and running a business, I would love to understand that hidden majority, right? That, and I'll just share a little anecdote very quickly that we just exhibited at a trade show. Whenever this woman walked up to our booth and did the typical thing that I think everybody does when a salesperson jumps out and says, hey, how are you doing? She all of a sudden had to find something in her bag and was trying to avert her eyes. And then, funnily enough, she looked at my name tag and went, oh, Matthew Byrne, you're the host of that podcast. I love your podcast and I really want to engage with you. And I was like, that was an interesting thing that happened in that sort of measurement of the ROI of what we're doing at that trade show and what we're doing with the podcast and all of that kind of thing. That there was this particular customer who really did like us and really wanted to hang out with us. But you wouldn't have been able to measure it had it been one of my other salespeople. So there's that sort of interesting dimension that you're mentioning about that longer term ROI measurement.
Absolutely. It's so interesting that you mentioned that too, because I find marketers and events people in general, we understand that concept, right? Like you're like the impact of me having content out there that makes me visually appear, right? For people to put me into a context that they can connect with and match with, be it my name, my face. It takes that like whole, you're not quote unquote hiding behind a business, right? You've personalized your business, which makes it easier on the sales side as well for people to engage with you, which you just stated. It's really hard to measure, but it's kind of not, right? Because like you can have that. You can also translate that into your sales team and build in your sales team or in general your arcing team into conversations that engage that same experience where people, I've seen it happen with some of my clients that we've moved into like podcasting or having them like develop out a more digital, like stronger strategy. And we'll put in sales individuals into conversations and podcasts with the team. It's so funny. They'll be at the booth and people will walk up and be like, I've seen you before, or have I met you before? And they engaged with them in content. And that created this, like, she was going in her purse and she was like kind of distracting herself because she didn't know really what to say or what to do. And then when she saw you, as like this personalization where maybe you've never met before, but this experience we engage with, that emotional connectivity that drops this like veil that is so strange, at like networking events where nobody knows how to truly engage with people. And like creates like a very weird dynamic, which is like one of my biggest pet peeves, is like unorganized or undirected like networking experiences. And so I'm just commenting on that because I think it's very, very important, especially for you as a company, to be forward facing, I think, and also the people on your team, and like engaging in them in those content conversations so that they have visibility, or they're seeing their name, consistently. Even sometimes through like email marketing, people will register a name and they'll be like, oh, I've heard your name before. And maybe you've sent out like 60 outbound emails to them, and never got a reply back, but they'll still remember that name, So just aligning with what you're saying. And I think it's a really smart like piece to your business model to continue to have yourself forward facing, because it creates a personalization, that's like, I think it is measurable, right? From those notes that you can add into your CRM if you wanted to. But that was kind of a rant. So
yeah, absolutely. I should actually get back to the questions at hand, but I do want to sort of just sort of cap that with the idea that maybe the measurable ROI is figuring out how we are increasing the likelihood of the next step on the sales cycle, right? We talk about this a lot within our organization and with our clients when we're designing events, that we say, look, if you do this thing, whatever it might be, like this customer outreach event or host a thing or do a trade show, we sort of look at the sales cycle in the buying cycle and say, well, we need to increase the likelihood that they're going to go from consideration to buying, or they need to go from awareness into consideration, right? And so, I don't have the answer, but I think it's an interesting way to maybe look at that ROI question that is constantly being asked in this, in the events world, of how do we measure the uptick in likelihood of conversion from step one to step two by doing this event, rather than looking at it as, we spent $1 million on this event, where's the $2 million worth of revenue, right? Because it will come and it will be slightly attributable to that effort. But I think that maybe that we've stumbled on the magic wand here, that it's about how does that affect the likelihood of conversion from step one to step two.
absolutely. 100%.
So we talked about this a little bit earlier. We were talking about, how social media uses, disgust and emotional triggers. Can you tell me, like, how do you feel that we need to balance ethical considerations and sustainability with these psychological and design principles in events?
Yeah, I really think it's based on integrity, right? And the conversation of integrity is different for everybody. But I really think it's imperative to, it's so funny. My dad worked in sales, or well, mostly raising investment funds, right? And so sales is a really big part of that. I think sales is a big part of that. And anytime you're a business owner, but those like car salesmen, and everyone has this like kind of this disgust with them, and there's like this slimy Vinnies, right? Exactly. You got your slimy Vinnies, right? And I think you really have to question that of like, how am I showing up as a slimy Vinny? Right. And this goes back into the psychological component of self-awareness. So we all have a slimy Vinny. We all have a component of us of like sales that we've been or we've interacted with that just does not, essentially align with our integrity. Every single person does. They say they haven't. God bless you. Please take me to church, and whatever church you go to, because it means you know something I don't, and I would love to learn that. But we all do. And being conscious of that, I think, is very important, especially in when we're creating branding or marketing components or sales development and overarching events presence. Because if we don't know what's kind of maybe unintegral about what we're positioning, we're going to have no idea a concept of what integrity means overall. And I think it's a really important aspect to know how you want to show up and why you want to show up, to build off of that integral component of who you are as a company, as a brand, as an individual. And it's, it takes a little bit of time, but also in the mechanics of, say, branding, like it can be as simple as, who are you trying to be? What's your brand messaging? And why is it important, right? If you're just coming out to sell, and we're in such an interesting digital age, and like, maybe I'm aging myself here, and maybe I'm presenting myself into more of a conservative nature, but I think we really have to look at our basic natural instincts, and society and evolution psychology of how we present into that, and really kind of question if that's in line with our integrity and morale, which there's no right or wrong answer, but that's going to give you the equated model of what your onboarding is going to be per se for your customer, your consumer, your business, and also showcase how long they will stay engaged with you. And that's another big piece, is that like when you're integral, at least this is what I've seen, right? This is a personal identification. This is not the industry standard at all. But with specific brands, like when you're integral and you're coming from a place of alignment per se, brands and businesses stay with you longer term. And I've seen it through and through. Like, might get shot in the foot for this, but like Bang Energy, right, is a great example of this. They came out really hard. Their social media marketing was very interesting, also very engaging. It really hit into that reptilian style brain of evolution, psychology, and marketing. And then you have a company like Celsius, right, which was this long-term player that's been in the energy drink game. The original distribution was in like just a few selected gyms. I think it was like Planet Fitness, your Equinoxes, and like you couldn't really find them. They were like a drop in a puddle of so many energy drinks. But they had a very strategic long-term strategy with their content marketing in general and influencer marketing, and then their demo-based marketing, where they stayed very integral in that alignment in conceptuality, right? And it led to them having this minor piece acquisition with Pepsi. They've now had some of the largest distribution, not only nationally, but now going global into the UK market, and their brand visibility is all withstanding. And that took like a 10-year marketing cycle and engagement. And they stayed very, very, very integral. They didn't have this spread out spill campaign, which a lot of people will do. And I think that's great, but they stayed very much in alignment with their core value as a company. And I think if you don't have those curated, you're going to get very lost into more of, misaligned marketing values per se that could really be detrimental to your company overarching. That's just my theory. That's just where I sit. But yeah, I hope that made sense. Sorry.
Finally, looking forward, like what emerging trends in psychology and design do you anticipate will have the most significant influence on event planning in the next few years?
Well, you named it earlier, right? When you were mentioning that there's a lot of companies and marketing agencies or agencies overall that are like B2B is kind of a spot to be. And what you're seeing is like this kind of that corporate identity that was like kind of very modest or very like cookie cutter is now very loud, and very engaging, visually, communicatively, like sensory. And so I think one of the biggest pieces we're going to continue to see is that overall, I think social sense is going to be the most impacted, and that's the sense of belonging. Even if it's going into a trade show and you're, at CES and you're a Google and you're trying to onboard smaller companies into your ads, ad sales that they do for you for SEO, you're going to engage this continued sense of belonging. And I think that conversation is going to continue. We now hear conversations about ecosystem development, partnership development. And I think those are going to continue to grow as well as, this is going to sound so LA, but that's fine. And I'm from Los Angeles, so I feel like I can do that because it's like a little woo woo. But there's also going to be this very intuitive sense within the market of wanting to engage in a way that's not just based off sales. That's going to be a lot more personalized. And you can see that with emails. You can see that even with the advancement of AI, which is definitely, like everyone knows, that's one of the largest trends that is happening. But there's going to be this deep desire, which goes back into social sense, emotional sense, but there's going to be this deep desire for personalization in anywhere that you are in the event-wide space, I think.
Absolutely. So finally, we always like to wrap up these episodes with a little bit of practical advice. So for the event professional that is listening today, what practical steps do you think that they can take to start really taking a look at the emotional and psychological impact of their designs and to get started on that journey?
Great question. Know thyself. Is the best way. And no one's ever going to know themselves fully, but I think they really go hand in hand. Just know yourself, know what you want, know what you need, and know how you communicate and engage, and then work off of that. If you're lacking, like for instance, for my own self is like operationally, I'm good and I'm great. Like a budget, don't mess with me in a budget. But there's some operational components that I learned from when I was brought into Avalanche or Avex, it's a large Web3 based company, that I had to learn how to become more operationally advanced. And I realized my flaws because I was very open to feedback and I couldn't see it. So I didn't know myself in that capacity. When I got that feedback, I sprinted into helping myself operationally develop better and create a muscle that used to be very weak for me in that sense, that became very strong, and also same with attribution in the sales model. Like I had to call a company that wanted to onboard me. It went horrible. And the woman and me were kind of fighting about attribution and how to like direct sales and how does that like match into events. And I took it very personal and I was like, ooh, this is something that maybe I need to learn more about and become more learn more into or lean more into. And that allowed me to want to go in and strengthen that muscle. So like be very open to critique, but then also know thyself, know where your weaknesses lie, and then just expand on those tenfolds, because that can help you overarching in everything that you do. And also, take breaks. Events are really stressful. Burnout is very real. We have take breaks. So thank you for that question. Yeah.
So Chelsea, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast. Where can people find you if they want to reach out?
Yeah, definitely. My website's www.freebornproductions.com. And also you can always reach out to me there or my email and LinkedIn.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks.
Production Value Matters, the Business Events Podcast, is brought to you by Byrne Production Services. To learn more about Byrne Production Services and how we can achieve your business goals with meaningful event designs and elevated production value, head over to byrneproductionservices.com. For tailored AV consulting, check out theavadvisor.com, where you can book a free 15-minute consultation. Also, be sure to search for Production Value Matters, the Business Events Podcast, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for listening.